today we will have our cycle of conferences of the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies in Spanish, excuse me, in Spanish, in English, of course. And we wish to thank very much Professor Tom Rawsky for being with us and for allowing us to know some of his recent research and work. I'm sorry we started a little bit late, but we had some technical difficulties that luckily we have overcome. I again simply wish to invite you to the audience and to the participants to the work we are doing at the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies and to this cycle of conferences that we are organizing together with my colleague and friend, Dr. Yolanda Trápaga Delfín. We will record this meeting and we will upload it to the cycle of conferences that we have started since 2015, 2005. No, we have more than 300 conferences by a large group of colleagues, friends from all over the world. And I would simply like to remind you, Professor Tom Rawsky, and Tom does not need any big introduction. I remind you, he's a professor, emeritus professor at the School of Economics of the University of Pittsburgh. He has been working for decades on China's economy on a variety of perspectives, no? Including forecasting attempts on China's growth, including environmental perspectives on China's urban air quality, and well, a large list of publications since the 1970s. And it's a big honor, dear Tom, to have you with us. No, I remind you we usually do a presentation of 30 to 45 minutes, and then we allow for questions and your responses through the chat. If you have problems looking at the chat, I would be very happy to support you in my function. No? So again, very much welcome to our Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Delighted to participate in your series. Thank you for the kind introduction. And please take charge of questions. I'm very bad at this technology, and I'd be delighted to respond to comments, but please act as masters of ceremonies. Here, my apologies for my inability to address you in Spanish, but I think you will be comfortable with this other language that we have here. Let me begin by reminding you of the famous quotation of the economist Alfred Marshall, who said that nature doesn't make jumps. And now we look at the Chinese economy, and it appears that the Chinese economy has made an enormous jump. And what we're looking at in the past several decades is really the biggest economic growth spurt in human history. This is not just a big event in 20th century economic history, it's an event in world economic history. And that's reflected in our daily lives. When I started teaching about China's economy, my first order of business was trying to persuade people why you should be interested in China. But we don't need to do that anymore because China is on the front page of all of our newspapers on a regular basis. Nevertheless, I want to offer you the opinion that China's economic spurt is not a miracle, but rather it is the outcome of interaction among resources and institutions and incentives and market structures and policies, just as we analyzed other elements of economic change. There are historical roots to this boom. I think we cannot understand what's been going on, nor I think can we understand what's likely to happen going forward without understanding the history. And if I'm right, the immediate implication of this is the talk of a China model or a Beijing consensus is mistaken, because without the historic background, we don't get the outcomes that we've seen in recent decades. And I'd like to talk about what I see as two key elements in these outcomes. One is central weakness. The weakness of the central government is a key element in the origin of China's Great Boom. And the second is what I would call traditional village economic culture, not the culture of the highly educated elites, but the culture of ordinary people in Chinese villages, which I think is very different from what I would call the economic culture of ordinary people in other pre-industrial societies. And what I think is different is not individuals. It's not, I mean, Adam Smith talked about the tendency of people to higgle and bargain. That exists everywhere. What's different in China is the organizational capacity that Chinese society injects into its members, and I will talk about that in a few minutes. But first, let me say something about the broader picture of China's political economy, which is consistent both historically and today. We have an authoritarian system. There is a notable absence of checks and balances. Individuals within the system operate on the basis of personal networks. And these networks require large amounts of resources. And the result of this is that policy decisions are routinely interspersed with personal choices involving networking. And this arrangement also lends itself to a culture of gift-giving, bribery, and corruption. The network leaders need resources to provide to their subordinates, to their adherents, and the adherents need to bring themselves to the favorable attention of higher ranking people in their networks. All of this, we see it today. We see it 50, 70, 90 years ago. We see it 200 years ago. And this has important consequences for private business, because private businesses of any scale cannot exist without the cooperation and support of officials, because the absence of checks and balances means that any form of private property is subject to expropriation or confiscation at any time without notice. Some years ago, The Economist had an article which they said something like this, that if there were a test of strength in Russia between the government and the mafia, it is not clear who would come out on top. China is completely different. No business, no organization in China can withstand the onslaught of government attention. And we see this very clearly. Look at what's happening to some of the strongest and wealthiest business leaders in China, some of the strongest and wealthiest business enterprises in China. If the leadership turns hostile attention on these people, on these organizations, they cannot fight back. They can't hire lawyers. They can't go to court. They are completely at the mercy of the government. And this means they have to find ways to insure themselves against hostile government action. And they do this often by purchasing immunity or shelter, or by taking actions that reflect what government wants them to do. This system conflicts with bottom-up innovation, which runs into incumbent networks. I'm sorry. Excuse me, my computer is causing trouble here. There, sorry, excuse me. This conflicts with bottom-up innovation. It conflicts with decentralization. It conflicts with economic openness, with entry and exit. So this growth spurt is partly the result of a weak center. And at the start of reform in the late 1970s, the center was so weak that even, for example, it commanded the localities to reject the household responsibility system. Even as the household responsibility system spread across the Chinese landscape, people in Beijing were loudly announcing that this was forbidden, and furthermore that it wouldn't work. I mean, this illustrates the weakness of the Chinese government at the time, and this is not the first time that weak center and decentralized innovation have been prominent in the economic history of China. In the early decades of the 20th century, weak center allowed, for example, the replacement of the bimetallic currency system with banknotes, which vastly reduced transaction costs. In the 19th century, weakness of the central government allowed foreign pressure to create treaty ports. It allowed the creation and spread of the Li-Jin or Li-Kin taxes on local commerce, which spread across the landscape very rapidly in the same fashion as the agrarian reforms of the 1970s and 1980s. And I recently discovered that even the spread of cotton more than 1,000 years ago resulted from central government weakness. The central government was focused on silk culture, but central government weakness allowed localities to introduce cotton. So let me now focus on this element of village economic culture. And I think the way to do this is to look what happened after the introduction of agrarian reform in the late 1970s. There was a tremendous spurt of output. Agricultural output went up, even if as millions of people fled farming to engage in all kinds of non-agricultural businesses. This started from a level of what the World Bank calls absolute poverty. The average calorie intake in China's countryside fell short of the World Bank standards continuously between 1959 and the late 1970s. Now, with this audience, there's no need to go into detail about absolute poverty. We all know, as development economists, that populations in absolute poverty require all kinds of government assistance in order to improve their income levels and productivity levels. But in China, there was a rapid increase in output, in incomes, in welfare, even as the level of outside support declined rather than increased. Nothing like this has happened historically anywhere in the developing world. According to World Bank analysis, hundreds of millions of Chinese escaped absolute poverty in the first decade of reform. And these figures understate what actually happened because they rely on standard Chinese government figures of incomes at the start of reform, which are way overestimated. They're based on very small and distorted samples. So the reality of rural reform signals that something is going on, something unexpected is going on. And I think I'm suggesting to you that the unexpected element is the cultural legacy of economic behavior in rural China. So first of all, think about the attitudes toward education and literacy. This is a society, and I think this is well known by now, that values education. A recent author says that it's hard to exaggerate how deeply burned into the Chinese psyche is the respect for learning. This is so apparently across all society and all families, even in the depths of social space. And people valued literacy both for possible upward social mobility, but also for practical purposes. Traditional village society is permeated with the trappings of the marketplace. Everything is exchangeable. We see contracts not just for land and for labor, but for human beings. Written contracts for wife sharing. For example, a man is physically weak. He owns land, but he can't cultivate it. And so he signs a contract with other men who will till the soil in exchange for access to the proprietor's wife. There are contracts for inheritance, contracts for loans. There are also informal enforcement mechanisms. People witness contracts. There's a system of danbao, guarantees. That is to say, you guarantee my performance. If I fail to perform, you are held responsible. Shareholding is widespread in historic Chinese villages. There are organizations with both informal and formal regulations. Entrepreneurship is widespread. When we begin to see rural surveys in the early 20th century, the most common occupation other than farming is peddling. In shipping industry in China, the sailors are often receive no wages, but they receive cargo space. In European overseas exploration, the officers receive cargo space. The sailors do not. This is an economy of capital scarcity, the Chinese imperial economy. And that means, for example, that merchants will pay to speed up transactions. So we have a class of individuals who act as go-betweens. You come with your boatload of merchandise into a port. I present myself and say, excuse me, but if you pay me 0.25% commission, I will introduce you to people who want to buy the cargo that you are carrying. And people are willing to hire such intermediaries because they're in a hurry to sell their cargo and run back and get another one. And this means it's possible to enter business with zero capital. If you are a person of good reputation, you can become a business operator with literally no money to start with. And we see the consequences of this economic culture when Chinese emigrate abroad. Look at the impact of Chinese migrants in the economies across Southeast Asia. They dominate these economies. In the 19th century, Thai foreign trade, for example, was controlled completely by Chinese. Chinese advisors to the throne, Chinese boatmen, Chinese ship captains, Chinese merchants. Even in Japan, Chinese merchants were prominent in international trade in the 19th century. And remember that the migrants to Southeast Asia were not elites. They were not people with high levels of education. They were often refugees from areas that had poor agricultural conditions. A very interesting recent article somehow managed to show where migrants from Fujian province in southern China came, and he found that the strongest correlation is the migrants are people who lived in interior counties that had poor agricultural conditions and from which one could get to the coast without passing through agricultural regions that had good economic conditions. In other words, these migrants are refugees from poor economic conditions who didn't find a promising stopping place before they got to the coast. So these are the migrants, coolies, refugees from bad agricultural conditions, and they go into these countries in Southeast Asia and quickly achieve dominant positions in local economies. Similarly, with Chinese migrants to the United States, not the current situation when many of the migrants are graduates of the finest universities in China, but in earlier decades, when Chinese migrants were people with little or no education, successive American 10-year censuses show that households with Chinese ethnic background had above average incomes. I don't know the circumstances in Central and South America. Perhaps some of you can offer information about this later on. So I think what happened in the late 1970s is that these people who were trapped in the commune system where they didn't have enough to eat, they were prevented from participating in entrepreneurial activity. You read accounts of China during the Cultural Revolution. People are prevented from exploring alternatives to improving their circumstances. These are people who are putting their children to bed hungry, night after night, week after week, year after year. Suddenly, they see an opportunity and they rush to embrace it. So once the reform takes place, every element of the capitalist road instantly reappears. Markets, supply chains, contracts, informal contract enforcement, bribery, circumventing policy requirements. All this jumps into view. For example, rural industry developed in China during the 1960s and 1970s. By 1978, there are 1.5 million rural firms. By 1985, there are 12 million. And by 1990, there are 18 million firms with nearly 100 million workers. And the question is, who managed these firms? Who kept the books? There was not a migration of urban people to do this. Remember, in China, everybody knows which way is up. When people were forced to go live in the countryside during the 1960s and 1970s, this was called xiafang, going down. The countryside is down, the city is up. The reform period was a period in which people who had been forced to move to the countryside ran back to the cities. So where did the management of these firms come from? Where did the accountants come from? So the reality is that from looking at what happened, we know that there were literally tens of millions of people in rural China in the late 1970s who had the capacity to manage firms, many of which became big exporters. By 1990, these rural industries accounted for a substantial proportion of China's exports. And this is totally different from what we see in other low-income countries. I've always been struck, for example, by writings of Uma Lele, who is an economist at the World Bank, about Africa, showing that in many African countries, even small projects require expatriate management. We had a student at University of Toronto when I was teaching there who wrote about factory operations in Africa. And he told about a soap factory where the local government had a indigenization policy. They kicked out the European managers. the management was turned over to local people. The local people knew what they were doing, but even so, the factory didn't work. And eventually, they had to bring back the Europeans, and the student reported that when the Europeans arrived to take control, the workers came out, greeted them, carried them in on their shoulders, because everybody knew that the factory was falling apart in the absence of European management. Things like this don't happen in China. The Chinese, they know how to run things. Sometimes they run them badly, but there's this inherent capacity to manage, to keep the books, to operate, that is not widespread in rural areas of other low-income countries. And of course, this big development in agriculture unleashed the whole boom, because the agricultural boom immediately solved the food problem in China. It immediately relaxed the balance of trade constraint. China had been devoting a lot of its foreign exchange to importing food. It immediately released huge numbers of workers. It immediately increased the material foundation for other consumer-oriented industries, and it immediately gave people confidence that reform could work as they tried much more difficult reforms in the urban areas and in the industrial sectors. And also, I think, great importance, it pushed aside critics who said that these reforms are bad, that this is capitalism, it's not socialism, and so on. This is, for the first time in Chinese history, everybody was suddenly better off. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and it just had a huge impact on psychology as well as on the economy. So since then, the reform has continued. During the first decade of reform, it's mainly a bottom-up development. The center continues to struggle. The center's share of tax collection and the center's revenue as a share of national income go down. The provinces and localities continue to experiment and innovate. The center tries to support its clients through bank lending, and the result is inflation and the instability surrounding the riots and disturbances in Beijing and elsewhere. During the 1990s, there is an interlude that I don't feel I quite understand. There are two things going on. One is a continuation of market opening. So we see the end of central material allocations. We see a wider opening to foreign trade and investment. We see new opportunities for private business. But at the same time, the center manages to reconstitute its authority through fiscal reforms, through banking reforms as well, and through a cleaning up of the state sector. Essentially, what the state center does is it cuts loose large numbers of clients, both enterprises and workers. It redefines what part of the state sector is essential and cuts loose the rest. So, for example, perhaps 50 million people are laid off from state enterprises during the 1990s. So this seems to me somehow reflects a compromise between the advocates of market opening and market orientation and the advocates of central control. And I myself don't feel that I understand quite how this worked out, but I think this is what was going on during that decade. And Since 2000, I think we've seen a slowing of reform, a revival of central control. The market-oriented viewpoint reached a high point in 2013 when the Communist Party passed a decision about the decisive role of market forces in the economy. And people outside China, including myself, thought this was an important turning point, but it turned out that this was not the case, that the current administration under Mr. Xi Jinping is moving in the opposite direction, focusing on state enterprises rather than private enterprises, focusing on top-down strategies and initiatives rather than bottom-up, focusing on world-class innovations rather than less visible innovations in the supply chain, dialing back on international economic cooperation and the participation of foreign enterprises in China's economy, expanding Communist Party intervention across the board in business, in education, and so on. Just two examples of this. One, by around 2011, the share of private business in bank lending was around 50%. By 2016, it had dropped to 11%. I'm very interested in that statistic. And I've been hounding my friend, Nicholas Lardy, who's another person you might add to your list of speakers. When are you going to get the latest information about this? And it turned out they stopped publishing that particular statistic. So this come out in the yearbook of banking and finance. Now the yearbook of banking and finance no longer includes statistics on the breakdown of bank lending between state borrowers and private borrowers. Another example, I've just returned from the annual meeting of the Association for Asian Studies. And we had many of our panel discussions online this year. There were many participants located in China. And we discovered that a number of our participants were dissuaded from participating, pulled out in the last minute. And in some instances, apparently people received visits from the police after participating in a international Zoom session like this. I mean, this illustrates the current attitude toward foreign participation. And we can think of this in historical terms. In the 19th century, people were very anxious about what we might call the soft penumbra of surrounding Western technology. So there was this idea that we can use Western technology, but the foundations must be Chinese. So this, in Chinese, the word for foundation is qi, and the word for utilization is yong. So the idea is we can use the technology. We should watch out for the creeping Westernization that may accompany this technology. And this is exactly what we see in China today. We don't want people to use foreign textbooks because these subversive foreign attitudes toward democracy, toward participation, toward freewheeling journalism are somehow creeping out of these textbooks. And the same thing with this episode this past week with people being pulled out of our panel discussions online. So the consequences of the current realignment in China, I think, are quite predictable. There's been a big drop-off in productivity growth. We see a revival of the latent potential, which was so large in the 1970s, probably larger than any economy at any time in world history. We see a continuing decline in the efficacy of investment. We see a continuing clampdown on foreign investment and on overseas participation, emphasizing self-reliance. I must say, I don't understand this. I think the Chinese economy has very big growth potential. And right now, it's only because the underlying private sector momentum, which is still there, just as it was during the Mao Zedong period, when it was suppressed powerfully, and now it is suppressed strongly, less powerfully than in the Mao period, but still strongly. This is keeping the Chinese economy afloat just now. But I don't understand the thinking surrounding the current policy mix. I mean, if you draw a circle around wherever President Xi operates, say of 10 kilometers radius, there are hundreds of economists trained in the finest schools in the world there who understand the importance of competition and the importance of openness, both in the domestic market and the international market, to China's ongoing boom. And yet policy continues to move in the opposite direction. So one possibility is that the political leaders don't want to hear from their economists. Another possibility is that the economists are afraid to speak their minds. But perhaps a third possibility is that the political requirements of the networking structure within the political economy in China just overpower economic, I'm thinking the word imperatives, but that's going too far. The economic policies that are supportive of better results. And of course, as we read in the press, there are objective difficulties mounting as well for China. There's no growth in labor force going forward. There is no longer a possibility to increase productivity by transferring large numbers of people from the rural economy to the urban economy. China is a big importer of food, energy, and raw materials, and now we have global inflation that are raising the price of all these things. But for whatever reason, Chinese leaders are steering the economy in what I see as unproductive, indeed often counterproductive directions, mainly in the short term, but some of their policies have long-term implications too, such as politicizing education. I speak only for universities in this part of the world that I inhabit. You have your own opinions about universities in your part of the world, but around here, we have lots of problems in universities. But one problem we don't have is that we're not forcing faculty and students to sit around talking about the thoughts of Donald Trump or the thoughts of Joseph Biden, but that is what is happening in China. So my conclusion here is that, first of all, what we're looking at in China in our lifetimes is a remarkable process, and it's a historical process. We don't understand this unless we think about the history. And I think the same applies going forward, that we don't do a good job of understanding China's likely economic trajectory unless we think historically. In the short term, China's economic prospects look surprisingly poor despite the underlying strength of China's economy. Let me stop there and look forward to your thoughts.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much for your very interesting and provocative thoughts. No? By the way, I invite our audience to look at one of the most recent publications of Lauren Brandt and Tom Rawsky called China's Great Economic Transformation. It's a huge volume, more than 800 pages, 20 chapters, one including also of Lauren Brandt and Tom regarding China's Great Economic Transformation, which is a great invitation on these topics. No? So again, thank you very much, Tom. We are starting to receive some questions. Let me pose you a couple of questions, Tom, before we get into the questions of the audience. No? So how much is new for understanding this economic boom in the last 50 years? No? How much is historic and how much is new? No? If we read Ezra Fogel on Deng's biography, for example, well, he witnesses the difficulties of the central government at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, but still the policy options of the central government were enormous. Was it the central government or was it the Communist Party? Probably we would have to differentiate between them. No? One topic. And the second topic, Tom, would be, I don't know if you would agree, but I would see a contradiction between an authoritarian government, as you highlighted, and a weak central government. Is there a contradiction, or you don't see any contradiction on these issues? No? And finally, a third issue, I mean, what you mentioned, Tom, it would be very interesting if you could give us some references or deepen the idea of capitalists not advancing capital. No? This would run, if you want to, against Marx's thought in which profit rates it is described and based on advancing capital. No? But apparently this is not the case. So could you deepen a little bit on this thought? And again, based on this, we get back to the questions of the audience. No?
Let me go backward. So that your last point about capitalists without advancing capital, I apologize. I don't understand what you're getting at. So let me skip that. If you write me a note later or something, I'll be happy to respond.
Right.
Certainly, I would say that China's government is authoritarian, and sometimes it's stronger and sometimes it's weaker. So during the 1970s, it was very weak. Right now, it's not. It is strong. When it's weak, the center has difficulty in enforcing its mandates. People down below feel free to strike out in independent directions without authorization or even contrary to the instructions from above. And I would say even when the authoritarian government is strong, it is always focused on certain issues. They can't control everything all the time. So I think our political science colleagues have shown very clearly that in all periods under the People's Republic, there is local initiative, especially in areas where the center is not focused. And when the center suddenly shifts its focus, then the localities scramble to comply. Just an example, this past year, last fall, the center suddenly discovered that many provinces were not fulfilling their mandates for lowering energy consumption per unit of GDP. And so provinces and cities suddenly started shutting down energy consuming activities. In some places, even they went so far as shutting down traffic lights as they scrambled to avoid the wrath of the center. And this one also shows both points. The center wasn't focusing on this energy coefficient, and so nobody was paying attention to it. because the lower levels in China are always being bombarded with instructions. You must do this, you must pay attention to this, make an important point of this, high priority for, they can't do all this stuff. So they try and select the areas where they see the center as being most sharply focused, and they try to comply, and then other areas they ignore. And your first point, what is new during the reform era? Well, many things are new. I mean, first of all, this government is much more sharply focused on economic growth than previous governments. I mean, even the Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek was much more strongly focused on economic growth than its predecessors. In fact, the Harvard historian William Kirby talks about the Kuomintang as organizing the new developmental state in the 1930s, and indeed many of the state economic planning apparatuses and many of the emphasis of the Kuomintang government spilled over into the People's Republic. For example, the Kuomintang's planners merged into the State Planning Commission, and the Kuomintang already brings in the emphasis on what people widely term heavy industry, military-related production. This all comes from the 1930s, and even economic thinking during the 1930s among the elite, including many who were educated overseas, comes to the conclusion that a market system is not good and that we need central planning. So that the consensus favoring central planning and state organization of the economy over market system is clearly in place, at least 10 years before the communists take over. But even so, the PRC government has a big apparatus for promoting growth that doesn't exist elsewhere. The People's Republic has much higher level of fiscal revenue as a share of national product. Also, by the 1970s, the labor force is far better educated than at any prior point in Chinese history. You have virtually universal primary school education, and middle school education is going to expand. Public health is vastly different. It's a very odd setup in the 1970s. I mean, you have these people who this system that I think anticipates the World Bank's basic needs idea. I think that this idea perhaps comes from China, and where you have emphasis on public health, this idea of low-level medical personnel throughout the rural areas, so reducing infant mortality, reducing maternal mortality, vaccinating against polio at a very early stage. This is something I follow very closely because I had polio myself as a child. So just now, India and Pakistan are completing the universal vaccination against polio, and the Chinese did this in the 1960s. But at the same time, the people didn't have enough to eat. Even though they were all going to school, they were all getting vaccinated. It's a very strange system. Also, the infrastructure was far better, even in the 1970s, than it had been in under previous systems. But I will emphasize my belief that the initial phases of the reform had much less to do with the government, much less to do with the center, much less to do with five-year plans, much less to do with the Communist Party, and much more to do with the unleashing of energies and capabilities that had been suppressed during the Mao period. And they didn't learn about contracts and business management and informal contract enforcement under Mao Zedong. There weren't business schools and so on. In fact, the public environment was intensely hostile to these things. Villages had loudspeakers that drummed anti-market, anti-capitalist, anti-profit-seeking ideas into the ears of the population for decades prior to the reform. As one gentleman said to me in 1975 during a village visit, he pointed to the loudspeaker on a telephone pole and said, "Chairman Mao speaks to me." And my own thought was, if I lived there, I would want a pair of snippers. I had to cut the wire, but this gentleman was happy to hear directly from Chairman Mao in his home in a rural village.
Great. Tom, we have a group of questions. I will sum two of them, and then maybe we can do a second round. No, and I believe the first two questions are somehow related. The first question by Santiago Roca, a more provocative question probably. He simply asks, are you implying the Chinese own a genuine genetic code or capacity to manage and innovate? No? And the second one by Jorge Hirsch, do you see any parallelism between China and South Korea development?
I mean, I would resist the word genetic. I think this is social. It's a social capacity. It's a learned capacity. It's an inherited capacity, but it's not. It is not genetic. I mean, there is a Chinese word called tuan go, which means group buying. And what this means is the people who are strangers get together online, and then they approach businesses and say, just for example, let's all go down to the Honda dealership tomorrow morning and say, we're going to buy 30 Hondas if you give us a 30% discount. Take it or leave it. If you don't want it, we'll go to Toyota and offer them the same thing. I've repeatedly asked American audiences, you ever do anything like this? And they don't. I said, what's the matter? Don't you want to save 30% on buying a car? It just doesn't occur to people in our system to do this sort of to do this sort of thing. But the Chinese, who got internet, of course, long after we did, it's a natural thing for them to do. They quickly think of some innovative, collective mechanism that will enable them to save money. And also dealing with bureaucracies, even foreign bureaucracies. Think about the New Oriental School, this company in Beijing that does tutoring and also systematic cheating on entrance examinations for international graduate schools. They send people to take, for example, the TOEFL test of English, and those people's job is to memorize the questions. And then they circulate these questions. There are Chinese bookstores that are filled with books about how to get into graduate school in overseas. And just think about this. Chinese students, I think, I've not looked at this statistically, but I think it's true that Chinese students are much more successful in entering and especially getting financial support to attend US graduate schools than Indian students. And this is very odd because in India, students in high-class educational institutions are essentially native English speakers, and the Chinese are not, and English is part of the requirement to get in. So these are the sorts of things that I mean. China and Korea, let me be quick because my knowledge of Korea is very limited, but certainly China has carefully studied and in some respects followed the Korean approach to, particularly to industrial development. So there's definitely a link here, but I hesitate to go further because I'm really ill-equipped to talk about Korea.
Okay, Tom, two additional questions, one by Francisco Valderrey. Great conference. Do you think that, and a different topic, do you think that the war in Ukraine may have a relevant impact on the dual circuit economy in China? One question. And the second question by Lourdes Marquina, a colleague. Dr. Rawsky, thanks for your lecture. I wonder what kind of values have influenced the relations between the government and common people, as you argued in your presentation, no? Who live in China and also overseas, no?
Sorry, the question is what kind of values?
What kind of values have influenced the relations between the government and common people who live in China, but also overseas?
On the question of Ukraine, I don't have any specific thought about how the Ukraine episode may influence Chinese domestic policy, other than to say, and this is, I think, true worldwide, there's a sudden shift of emphasis toward energy security. And this is very clear in China. So just recently, they're ramping up coal production. They've announced a plan for storage of something like 2/3 billion tons of coal. But I think more broadly, I think the Chinese, like everyone else, including myself and including Mr. Putin and his associates, have been stunned by the sanctions that were put in place. I mean, I have thought of sanctions as being generally ineffective weapon of economic warfare. But what's happened is that the United States and its European allies have devised a set of sanctions that go way beyond anything that we've seen before. And it's immediately obvious that the Russians, even though they were preparing for this for years, had no idea what was coming. So it appears that 10%, something like 10% of Russia's gold and foreign exchange reserves are sitting in Japanese banks, where they're now locked up. And perhaps even more was sitting in Switzerland, where they're now locked up. I mean, this is a monumental failure of intelligence on the part of the Russians. So something like 20 countries were involved in the preparation of these sanctions, and the Russians had no idea what was coming. And I think the same is true of the Chinese. So my personal thought, and I've talked to a number of people, including people who know a lot more about this than I do, and they all say the same thing. I think the probability of Chinese military action against Taiwan has gone down dramatically because of this Ukraine business, as the Chinese contemplate the prospect of being on the receiving end of this new array of sanctions. Now, of course, imposing such sanctions on China would be far more difficult than imposing them on Russia, because the blowback on the economies of the sanctioning countries would be far greater in the case of China than it is in the case of Russia. But certainly this focus on energy security is the one big domestic consequence. I mean, it's possible that watching this Ukraine situation unfold will persuade the Chinese to an even greater degree that we should limit our dependence on international trade and cooperation. But that that idea is already very strongly visible in the pre-Ukraine policies. Now, switching to the question about relations between government and common people, I think this is an interesting and important subject. It's one that the Chinese government is very conscious of. I mean, we can say this is an authoritarian system. The people in China have no say in choosing their leaders. We can say that this is a government that is often treats its people very harshly, and people have a lot of complaints about their government, and there's a high level of corruption, malfeasance, insider dealing in the system, and yet I think it's also the case that people in China have a lot of complaints about the government, but in general, their view of their own government, I think, is a favorable view. I think this rests on two elements. One is prosperity. The government or the parties says to the populace, look at your economic circumstances, look at the opportunities facing your children, compare those opportunities with the opportunities that your own parents and grandparents faced, look at the huge difference, and thank us for presiding over a system that provides you with these improvements. So I think if you're thinking back 20, 30, 50 years, has this system delivered the goods for people? The answer is absolutely. And similarly, what I would say is the second pillar of the system is national standing. This government, is China part of the group of 20? Do people talk about a group of 2, the US and China, as the global leaders? Did we return Hong Kong? Do we have the Olympics in Beijing? Does China's global standing rise? And the answer is absolutely yes. Again, I think the government party have delivered on this promise, and I think people respect this. One of my friends in Beijing, someone who hated the Communist Party, hated the system. I can say this because my friend is deceased. One year I arrived in Beijing and he said, "What's going on with the Western media?" He said, "They're saying that Chinese people don't like the Asian games here in Beijing." He said, "What nonsense. I took my grandson to the Asian games. We watched the track meet. It was wonderful." So here even someone who's viscerally hates the Communist Party is standing up for their achievement in raising China's international profile. So I think the government goes about this in a very conscious way. They do opinion polling, opinion surveys, and they're very careful to permit limited expressions of frustrations and resentment and resistance. At the same time, they fiercely crack down on opponents when they see that as important. So I think that it is a mistake to think of the Chinese population sort of seething under the yoke of this oppressive regime. And this is partly a successful effort on the part of this regime to extinguish any inkling of an alternative regime. So even among people who don't like the system, well, suppose they were to disappear tomorrow morning, what happens? And people in China, and this is a historical phenomenon, they fear disorder. The Chinese word is luan. They fear disorder, and if the communists were to go away, step back, if their system were to be dissolved, then we're in disorder. And people are deeply concerned about that possibility. So I think that historically, the depth of allegiance to ideas of democratic governance, even among the highly educated elite, are very, very shallow. Even going back to the 19th century, the introduction of the word democracy into China was, the definition was ruled by the mean people, the lower order of people, this sort of thing. So I think government, the interactions between government and population are very important subject, and this is an area in which I think the government has done a very good job of managing a potentially difficult situation.
Okay, Tom, one last very interesting question by Bruno Gandelgruber. Hi, Bruno. And the question that is also related to discussions and debates with Barry Norton, that you know very well, and others. No, Bruno asks, can we apply the standard analysis of capitalist systems to the Chinese economy? No, or do we need an alternative analytical tool? No? For example, no, when you talk about the absence of a system of checks and balances, would this refer to checks and balances such as in the US or Western Europe? Isn't there a possibility a different type of checks and balances are operating in China? Clearly, there is some kind of checks and balances in China, but at least it is different, no? What would be your opinion, Tom, on this discussion?
Let me say this, that I always thought that in addition to the standard analysis of the market system, there was some kind of what one might call socialist economics that I didn't understand and hadn't studied. And I had this idea until I spent a month in China in 1986 with a World Bank group studying graduate education in China. And one of my assignments was to study textbooks. And I looked at textbooks of political economy, which they described as the core of the curriculum. And they were horrifying. They were like, when I was in high school, I was required to take a compulsory course in religion. And they were just like that. Then my religion course, I learned that Moses said this and various other saints said this and Jesus said that. And the political economy books were exactly the same, that Marx said this and Lenin said that, and so on. They were completely useless in terms of any practical economic problems, such as should we build hydro plants or thermal electricity plants, where to put the bridge, where to build the highway, and any economic issue. So much so that when we first started admitting Chinese students to our graduate program, I was actively opposing the admission of students who offered degrees in economics, because I knew that they would first have to unlearn whatever they had learned and then start from ground zero. So I can't deny the possibility that there is some alternative economic arrangement that might enable us to produce an illuminating study, say, of the Chinese economy. All I can say is that I've been a close student of economics for about 60 plus years, and I have not found it yet. And I'm afraid I have similar thoughts about checks and balances. I mean, I'm not here to say that there are no checks and no balances in the Chinese system, but I would say that on the basis of what I've learned studying China for a long time, these are few and far between. And if we follow the activities of the current Chinese leadership, we can see how wide the latitude is for uncontrolled behavior. There's an interesting book called Red Roulette, which I would recommend. This is a book written by a man who was born in Shanghai, educated in Hong Kong, then studied in the United States and returned to China. And he was half of a team. He teamed up with a woman who was born and raised in China, not highly educated, but very adept in social interaction. And they became intimate with family members of some of the top Chinese leaders, and they conducted business operations in which the author was the business operator, and the woman they eventually married handled the personal relations with these elite family members. And this gives a very clear picture of what is going on in what we might describe as Chinese high society. I mean, this is sort of inside scoop that you expect from people like Washington Post journalists. It is very informative on this question of what checks and balances there might be on Chinese elites. So I guess in both areas, I am skeptical about the presence of alternative intellectual frameworks, or in the second case, alternative political economy circumstances than the ones that we might describe as standard operating procedure for political economy studies in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. One, in thinking of finishing and not taking too much of your time, one completely different question. I have the increasing impression, Tom, and also related to one of your comments, that today, in 2021, 2022, it is becoming increasingly difficult to engage in academic cooperation with Chinese counterparts. No, you just briefly mentioned the difficulty with the recent Asian Association meeting, but this has been also increasingly common for the work we are doing here in Latin America. It is increasingly difficult to count with chapters in seminars, visits, etc. Sometimes this is very explicit because you know the people for 20 years and they let you know. Sometimes they simply do not respond or show off or show up or whatever, you know. Is this your personal experience and in your network?
Absolutely. I think that I referred earlier to this Qi and Yung contrast, which I think is very much present among the leadership and in the party in China today, and it casts a pall of suspicion over individuals and activities that link up with overseas cooperators in ways where the authorities can't see what's going on. They cannot monitor the exchange of ideas, and they become concerned that somehow the Chinese participants are absorbing dangerous, hostile ideas so they rub off, not just from people like me, but even people like members of today's audience. I think this is not a new thing. I spent a considerable amount of the past decade studying electricity in China. When we first went to China looking to study electricity, I had a Chinese acquaintance who was both a researcher and an entrepreneur in the electrical industry. This was probably in 2012. He just picked up the phone and called people and said, hey, I've got several North American colleagues. We're flying out to Chengdu or wherever tomorrow. Can we come visit your firm? And oh, yes, Huan Ying. And we go there and we get to see big executives in big multinational firms. The next year, already, we went back to China. We want to do the same sort of field work. We had the same Chinese associate clearing the way for us. It became much more difficult just in 1 year to arrange these sorts of things. So part of what's going on is there's a buildup of security concerns. And this is certainly true in the United States. At my own university, they issued elaborate, absurdly elaborate rules for dealing with foreigners. I wrote a memo at the time saying, hello, export controls, goodbye, international studies. And I think they may have modified these crazy rules. Subsequently, I'm retired, so I don't know what's going on at the university, but this is been building for some time. I think it's gotten much worse in the past a year or two. I met a Chinese fellow a couple of weeks ago who was shaking his head and saying this period, he's thinking about such things. The last several years are the worst period in China since 1978. He said that this time. He said that the last time I saw him several years ago. So the universities are in a very, very difficult position in China because they know that their long-term future is tied to globalization. They know that they need to interact with you and your colleagues and interact with me and my colleagues and send their people to graduate school at my place, at your place, and many other places, and meet you people and people like me at conferences. Otherwise, they become isolated. They don't know what's going on, just as they were prior to reform. When I first went to China in 1975, I could not believe what people didn't know. It was crazy stuff. I mean, one of the hosts was a man who was completely bilingual, who had served in the Chinese embassy overseas, utterly fluent in English. And he asked me, for example, what colleges or universities do American presidents attend? He said, what is the equivalent of Beida, Peking University in the United States? Crazy question. I said, I can't answer that. You have the striped pants set like Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and then you have totally different people like Harry Truman, who was a clothing salesman, and I could see that he thought this foreigner either he's just completely stupid, or he doesn't understand my question, or he's pretending that he doesn't understand my question and won't give me the secret information. Just utterly simple questions that anybody who knows anything about the American system would understand. They didn't know. Also in 1975, they're talking about exports. They produced batteries called white elephant batteries. Yes, and there was men's underwear called pansy underwear. They didn't understand the idea of presenting English speakers with batteries called white elephant or underwear called men's underwear called pansy. They had just said they just didn't know anything about the outside world. And the university people in China, they understand that they can't survive. They can't do what they want to do. They can't join the upper reaches of the global intellectual world if they're walled off in the way that their government wants to wall them off. But at the same time, they're answerable to the government. I mean, most of the universities and research centers in China are state-run institutions. They have Communist Party branches. they have to respond to the instructions that they receive, or else they'll be turfed out of their jobs, or their institutes will be pushed aside, and this happens. I mean, I know people in a top level policy advisory institute where they complain that they learn about new policies by reading the newspaper, and they have to phone around to find out what the new policy is, because they're now frozen out. The leadership doesn't trust them. The leadership turns elsewhere for advice. So our colleagues are in a terrible position, and in, I don't know about your universities, but in our universities, there is now arising something that we saw in 1989 when people said we got to cut off relations with these people. Look what they did. And I said to them, no, we don't want to do that, because if we cut off relations, we're going to hurt the people that we want to work with, and the people whose actions we're responding to, they won't mind. They'll be happy to cut off relations. The same thing now. So the natural reaction is we don't want anything to do with these people. My university felt obliged to shut down the Confucius Institute, which in some places, Confucius Institute interfered with academic life. Not at my university. I would have been the first to complain had they done so, but they contributed, and they never interfered. But we felt obliged to shut them down. And this sort of thing is happening all over the place. And again, the people we want to work with, the people whose cooperation we value, they're the ones that will be hurt if we cut relations. And the people whose actions we dislike, those people be quite happy to roll back ties with your schools and with our schools. So it's really a tough situation. I'm very happy that I have no responsibility for China policy, either in the university or even worse in the United States government. It's a very, very difficult situation. I see no obvious way out. It's just terribly complicated.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for your honest and deep impression and reflection. I have the increasing impression that for our counterparts in the academic life, as lawyers say, no, it's not that everything that you say can be used against you, but it is that everything that you publish can be used against you, no? Which means something that you published 5 years ago can be, for whatever reason, the concept can be used by the Biden administration in 2022 in a complete different context, and suddenly you are in a bad situation, no? So if there is no need to get into this kind of pressures, just don't do it, no? And increasingly colleagues are simply not replying and simply are not interested in participating because they gain very little from this cooperation, no? The day-to-day life is in China, not with the US, with Mexico, or with the European Union, no? But well, that would be a discussion for another conference, no? Tom, I wish to thank you very much for your time. I think we will invite to read some of your work, also based on your, I believe it's your latest edited book with Lauren Brandt, and with lots of very interesting chapters. And we will get back to you. No, I hope we can be in contact in the near future, as we are doing. No?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to converse with this lively audience. And as I said, if you want to explain your question about capital and capitalism, I'd be happy to try and respond by email. But thank you very much for your patience in listening to my thinking, and thank you for all these questions, which is the reason I agreed to participate in this sort of event.
No, thank you very much, and congratulations, no, on your patience and your long-term analysis. It's very impressive. It's an honor to have you here. So,
pleasure is mine. Thanks a lot.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you very much. And I remind everybody, we will have our next conference next week. You will receive the information by internet. Thank you, Tom. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.